Okay, everybody, it's a couple minutes after noon. We're going to get started. Thanks again for joining me today. Today, we're going to talk about tips and tricks, things you need to be aware of when you are first getting started in AWS. So just before jumping into the content, just a quick introduction. My name is Brett Gillett. I run Curious Orbit Cloud Consulting. We're an AWS consulting company located in Oakville, Ontario, so just outside of Toronto. I've been using AWS now since almost the very beginning. I looked back a couple weeks ago on my bills and found that the very first one I got was back mid to early 2007, when at the time, web hosting company that I was running, we decided to migrate some infrastructure out of our co-location to Amazon. So since that time, I've been working with enterprise customers to help them navigate sort of the journey to AWS, migrating or creating new infrastructure solutions on the platform. And most recently, I worked for a local reseller, a local solution provider, and helped them build out their AWS business over the last 4 years. Starting in January, I decided that it was time to go out and do my own thing. So that's where Curious Orbit Cloud Consulting came from. We primarily focus on helping AWS partners and AWS customers accelerate their journey to the cloud. So you can see here lots of hands-on technical experience. I hold 5 certifications. I used to be able to, just up until I think last week, say I held all certifications, but thanks to some new ones coming online, I can't do that anymore, but I do hold 5 certifications. When I'm not helping people with their Amazon infrastructure, I'm actually a hobby beekeeper. And funny enough, I get more questions about beekeeping than I do about Amazon Web Services. But anyways, I always like to just let everybody know that that's how I spend the majority of my quality time. So here's the agenda for today. We're going to cover off quite a bit of content here in a very short period of time. So it's going to be rapid fire, but it's really meant just to make sure you're thinking about some things that you need to be aware of as you're getting started, or if you've been in AWS for a while, some things that maybe you have overlooked. So we're going to talk first about the account structure that you should use for Amazon. It's important, and it's one of the things that's very easy to overlook because you're in a rush to get started. We're also going to talk about some best practices around how to secure your AWS account. Again, in the rush to get things done, in many cases, developers are standing up AWS accounts on behalf of their customers or their clients. Things get overlooked. So we're going to go through some best practices there. We're going to talk about billing and things you need to be aware of. Also tagging, super important, very easy to overlook. You can fix it later on, but it does become a more difficult or time-consuming task. So we'll talk about how to define a tagging policy at the very beginning. And once we've kind of run through that, we'll talk about deploying. So actually, once you've done this sort of foundation or groundwork, now you've got that environment set up, your account's secure. Let's talk about how do we actually deploy infrastructure solutions on Amazon. So a couple slides there just to get you thinking about different options that you have. So the first thing that we need to think about before doing anything, and you probably already have an AWS account, and that's fine, but you really need to think about what it is that your account structure is going to look like from this moment forward. And really, you have 2 options. You have a single account strategy. You just have a single AWS account with everything in that account, or you end up in a situation where you end up having multiple AWS accounts. My preferred is a multiple account setup. It does add to the complexity of the solution just generally, but in the end, it does the benefits associated with setting up and managing multiple AWS accounts does outweigh having everything in a single account. And we'll go through sort of why I feel that's important and what I recommend to not only partners that I'm working with, but also customers. So here is a very standard look at maybe an account strategy that you might think of. And we're going to go through sort of what this is and the benefits of setting it up like this. So we end up here with 3 AWS accounts. At the top, we have a master account, or what's commonly referred to as a payer account. And we'll come back to the concept of payer accounts when we discuss setting up your billing. And then underneath that payer account or master account, for this example, I have 2 other AWS accounts set up. I have a sandbox account, so maybe a development account where we're testing out new services, features, building out future versions of our application. And then I have, in this case, what I'm calling a production account. So where the actual solutions I'm deploying to my customers or developing for my customers would reside. You can see here also I've got in each of these sort of accounts, I've associated an email address. We're going to come back to the root account and the importance of that root account in a little bit. But what I'm showing here is the email address, the root account that I've used to create each one of these accounts. Now, sort of some benefits of doing this. Like I mentioned on the last slide, it is more complex. AWS has done a lot of work recently to help lower, I would say, the complexity associated with a multi-account strategy. They now have something called AWS organizations. If you're not familiar with it, I would suggest that you spend some time and have a look at it. There are some fantastic reInvent videos available from last year's reInvent conference that will help you get into what organizations is and how you can use it. So that'll help you simplify this multi-account strategy. So that's one benefit, easier to set up than it used to be and maintain. What's great about organizations too is we're now able to set policies for all of the accounts that we're managing. So it does sort of alleviate some of the administration overhead that we had prior to AWS organizations being released. The other benefit of this is that many of the services in Amazon have tiered pricing. So if you had standalone accounts, and many of the customers that I deal with end up in a situation where they have more than one AWS account, but they're not associated together. And when you do this type of an association, and we'll talk about it again when we get to billing, you get the benefits of the services that use a tiered pricing model. So as an example, the simple storage service, S3. The more storage you use, the lower the per gig per month cost is. So in this scenario, we're using consolidated billing. We'll come back to that to sort of associate all these accounts together. And now we're able to potentially benefit from the lower tiered pricing in, let's say, for example, S3. What happens is you get a single bill for all of the accounts, and Amazon sort of consolidates all of the services that you've used into one bill, and then they apply the discounts for the services that are affected by tiered pricing. So that's one benefit. Another benefit of the multi-account setup is it gives you some control over blast radius, for lack of a better term. In this case here, what I'm talking about is if something goes wrong in the sandbox account, it's much easier to control the fallout from that incident from leaking into the production account. If we had just a single account separated maybe by virtual private clouds, VPCs, the complexity there of setting up proper IAM policies and least privilege can get complicated very quickly. In this sense, we have users that exist in the sandbox account, users that exist in the production account, and effectively those two accounts are completely separated from each other. So again, it gives you the added benefit here of controlling blast radius if something happens. Okay. So those are just two of the, I think, many benefits. Just keep in mind, you are going to end up in a situation here where you have to manage more than one AWS account. This is still my recommended method of getting started in Amazon, regardless of the size. Even if you just have a single account for now, you really should end up with a payer or a master account and then that single account. And that's why I mentioned earlier on, if you've already got your AWS account, you can still do this. You can retrofit this. You can go out and create a new payer account and then associate your existing AWS account with the payer account, change the billing over, and you now have a multi-account strategy. The other thing that I always like to point out here, when it comes to the payer account, no infrastructure should be deployed in that payer account, the master account. It is really meant as sort of the billing account. That's all it should function as. I do have some customers that you can do things like reserved instance purchases and everything in your payer account. We won't dive into that in a lot of detail today, but it does work because of this idea of consolidated billing, which we'll talk about later. So this is your multi-account strategy. It's the way I recommend to do it. Benefits are that you get access to tiered pricing volume. You get the benefit of a blast radius around your different accounts. And although it does increase the complexity, it gives you, I think, a much more flexible solution down the road. So that's just one slide on account strategy. AWS has a lot of fantastic documentation out there that you can dig into on exactly how you could structure your accounts, things like shared accounts and security-only accounts, things like that. So just to put that in your head as something you should think about, if you haven't started, I would spend some time sort of deciding what that architecture looks like. If you have started already, figure out a way that you can retrofit in a multi-account strategy. So let's talk about securing your AWS account. This is where we'll spend the majority of the day today. What I find when I do consulting for customers is many of these things we're going to look at are very easy to overlook in the rush to deliver solutions. And you're putting yourself in a position where later on, some things that you would not want to happen may occur in your account, and you're responsible for that. So you want to secure this account from day one. The first, and I would stress probably the most important thing you can do, is properly secure the root account. And if you remember a couple slides ago when we had that multi-account strategy, there were the email addresses. Think of those email addresses and their passwords as the credentials for your root account. Every AWS account that you set up will have a root account. And it's important that you secure that properly. So what I always recommend to my customers and people where I go in and do security audits for them is make sure you lock that root account down. And there's a couple things that you should do with this root account. First and foremost, make sure you have a strong password, okay? Not password 123. You don't want anything easy to guess or a combination of words. I strongly recommend you use a password vault of some sort. I'm a huge fan of 1Password. I'm not saying that's what you have to use, but something like it to generate, very long, strong passwords, and use that password generation as the setting up your password of your root account. And then you can also use that to securely store that root account password. Don't write it down on a piece of paper. So make sure that you've got a strong password there. And the reason that we have to be very careful with this root account is it really has uncontrolled access to the AWS account. And it can do anything it wants, from deleting the accounts to standing up new infrastructure. So super important. Once you have set up a strong password on that root account and you've secured that password, if you have an enterprise password vault, I would recommend putting it in the enterprise vault where it's audited. You can see who's checking it out and when and for how long. If you're not in an enterprise, using something like 1Password is a great solution. LastPass, KeyPass, whatever you're most comfortable with. Just make sure you store it somewhere secure. Once you've done that, make sure a couple things. That first, your root account does not have access keys associated with it. In some of the older accounts that I have, the ones I actually still have my AWS account from 2007. And when we created that account, the root user actually had access keys. And we'll talk about what access keys are in a bit. You want to make sure that the root account in your AWS account does not have access keys. If it does, a couple things to recommend. The access keys, you would probably not want to just delete them immediately in case somebody is using them. Okay, probably not what you want to continue doing, but maybe disable them first, see if anybody complains, and if they don't, then delete them. What you want to do is remove the access keys for that root user. Again, because it's uncontrollable, if those credentials, the access keys, were to leak out of the organization, then somebody has uncontrollable access to your AWS account. So something that you want to avoid. On top of that, you should be using a multi-factor authentication device, whether it's a physical device or a virtual device, to add that additional layer of security to your AWS root account. I'm a big fan of a virtual token. I find them much more easy to just handle. I don't want to walk around with a whole ton of tokens in my pocket. So I use the Google Authenticator. You could use that. You could use a physical token from Gemalto. It's up to you. The point here is secure that root account with that additional layer of security with a multi-factor authentication device, be it virtual or physical. Once you've done the sort of basic security around the root user, strong password, removing access keys if they exist, and adding that additional layer of security to the account with MFA, I would immediately stop using that account. what you should do, and we'll get to it in a couple slides, is manage your environment through IAM users and groups. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So the root account, really, once you've got your account set up, you've created those first IAM users, you would only use that root account for very specific actions. So things like deleting the account, maybe changing some security credentials on the overall AWS account. But for the most part, the root account really should not be used after you set up the account. Another thing that is very easy to overlook are two services that are extremely cost effective and give you a very good understanding of what is happening in your AWS environment. So I always recommend, after you've secured that root account, before creating your users, because I want a good record of everything that happens, enable CloudTrail and AWS Config. So CloudTrail is basically an audit service. And what it's going to do is it's going to record all API activity that occurs within your AWS account. And I think of AWS just as a collection of APIs that are sort of pulled together in potentially a web interface or through some command line tools. Everything you do, whether you're interacting with your AWS resources via the management console, via a custom script that you've written through an SDK call, or by using the CLI, would be recorded by CloudTrail. So very valuable information. So enable it on day one and make sure that it's enabled for all regions. It used to be quite difficult to do this, or not difficult, but just time consuming. If you weren't using something like infrastructure as a service, which we'll talk about a little later, you actually had to go through all of the regions in AWS and enable it. AWS has made it very easy now. When you enable your CloudTrail trail, you can enable it for all regions. On top of that, AWS Config. I think of AWS Config as my configuration management database, my CMDB. If anybody is an ITIL person, they've probably heard that term more than they like. But your configuration management database basically gives you insight into all of the configuration items within, in this case, your AWS account. Now, it's not supported by all the services, but it's supported by the most common services that are used for getting started when you're first standing up your workloads in AWS. So enable CloudTrail and enable config. You're going to get a really great understanding of what's happening in the environment. If you have to do an audit later when something maybe happens, or if something happens, you can go back and see exactly what has changed in the environment. If you just need to be able to understand the infrastructure that's there, these two services are fantastic tools and will really help you gain a lot of insight into what's in your environment. The one additional thing I'll say about CloudTrail in particular is, while both the services write their logs to the simple storage service, S3, both of the services you would probably want to make sure that the S3 buckets are secured, in particular for CloudTrail. Since this is a security auditing tool for the most part, you want to make sure that those logs are secure. So when you're writing into an S3 bucket, you want to limit who has access to that bucket. If somebody were to modify or delete the logs, you've lost the value of that service. We'll talk about least privilege and IAM policies in a minute, but just CloudTrail in particular, make sure you secure the destination of the logs. Speaking of logging, we're not really going to talk about the VPC a whole lot today, the virtual private cloud, but inside the VPC service, there is something called VPC flow logs. You should also, I strongly recommend that you enable flow logs. You can do flow logs for the entire VPC, a subnet, an elastic network interface. You can be very granular or just sort of sweep everything up in one sort of location. It's, again, a great way to troubleshoot if things are going wrong. We're going to talk about security a little more later on, about security groups and network access control lists, but it's a great way to troubleshoot those. It's also a great way, again, in a situation that something has gone wrong in the environment, you've got network logs now of the VPC. So make sure you enable that as well. One of the first things that you should do, still using the root account, because it should be the only account in your environment at this point, or in your AWS account, is create IAM users and groups. And what you should do first is create an administrative user. You can use AWS managed policies to make that process simple. You just assign a single policy, and away you go. You've made that user an administrative user, which has all the rights that you would need to continue. So the first thing you want to do with that root account is create an administrative group, and then 1 or 2 users, a user for yourself and a user maybe for a coworker of yours that maybe is helping you with this, or another team member, and then associate those 2 users with the group, the administrative group that you've created. Once you've done that, you've created the group, you've assigned the AWS managed policy, the administrator policy, to that group, created and assigned those users to the groups, set up their credentials, all that good stuff. I would immediately log out of the AWS account with the root account and start using your IAM user. Okay. Another thing that I want to point out here, and it's super important, and it is often overlooked when you first get started, because there might just be 1 or 2 team members that are setting up your first AWS account. And it's quite easy just to say, well, I'll just assign the policies that I need to the user itself, the IAM user, Identity and Access Management user, rather than a group. That seems like a good idea at the time. But what's going to happen is over the coming months, your AWS account is going to grow. More and more services are going to come online, which means probably more and more users, IAM users, being created. And if you manage the policies associated with those users directly in their accounts, the amount of administration work that you're going to have to do later on will increase dramatically. So always manage access to your AWS account and to the resources that you're creating within the account via groups, okay, rather than assigning it directly to users. Another very important thing I always like to point out is IAM policies. There are 2 different types of policies. There are managed policies and inline policies, or unmanaged policies, if you want to think of them that way. I always recommend that you use managed policies. Managed policies, you have 2 options. You have AWS managed policies, and then you have customer managed policies, things that we create ourselves. I always recommend that you create your own managed policies. It does take a little more work at the front end of setting everything up, but it gives you way more flexibility, and it will also give us the ability to manage with least privilege, which is also super important. We're going to talk about it a little later on. The managed policies from AWS are fantastic. They give you a couple options, usually read access and then full access. In many cases, I don't want to give, I want something in between read and full access. So that's why I say create your managed policies, okay? IAM policies are just JSON files. You could create them in your own editor, your JSON editor. I would recommend at the beginning you probably don't do that. You use the policy generator that's part of IAM, and it will validate for you the syntax, the formatting of your JSON files, and it allows you to very quickly jump through the services you need and select the actions that are required for those services. So remember, you've got 2 types of policies. You've got managed policies and inline or unmanaged policies. And then for managed policies, you have AWS managed and customer managed. It takes a little more work at the beginning. It will slow you down a little bit. I would suggest you create your own managed policies from day 1. Okay. The biggest reason that you want to do that is this idea of least privilege again. We're going to come back to that in a minute. I want to make sure that you have enough access to do your job or perform the functions that you need to perform within AWS and no more. So here is a very simple example of a managed policy. So this is a policy that I created as a sample, and you can see here some basic information. We won't go through this in great detail, but an IAM policy allows you to define an effect, and that's allow or deny. Okay, so in this case, I'm allowing users or groups that have this policy assigned to them to perform 3 actions against a single service, the EC2 service. So you can see here, I'm allowing the entities that are assigned this policy to describe the instances that are in the account. So we're talking about EC2 here. So show me the virtual machines that are in my account. Also perform a start or a stop action on those EC2 instances. That's it. And I've gone 1 step farther here by adding a condition. So I'm a big believer in what I refer to as layered security. So we're going to build on top of everything we do. And using conditions inside of an IAM policy are a fantastic way to add an additional layer of security. So we're going to talk about MFA again, but in this case here, I have a condition assigned to this policy that says in order to perform these actions, you also must have multi-factor authentication. Okay? So just an additional layer of security. Sort of continuing on this idea of layering our security, let's make sure we secure all of the IAM user accounts that we create. Okay? Not just the root account. Let's start there, add multi-factor authentication to the root account, but then go that extra step, and regardless of the actions you can perform in the environment, always add multi-factor authentication to any user that can interact with your AWS environment. This is that idea of layered security. Okay? It's going to take, again, a little more effort at the beginning. You're going to have to actually enable devices, have users use their virtual tokens or their physical tokens and associate those with their accounts, and then they're good to go. But it allows us to add that additional layer of security. Okay? One of the easiest ways to, if you have an AWS account already, to determine who has MFA enabled and who does not is use what's called the credential report. You can run this through the CLI command, or you can just go into your management console in IAM, the Identity and Access Management dashboard, and select credential report. It's going to dump out, if you're going through the management console, just a CSV file, which you can open up. And one of the columns in there is going to tell you if MFA is enabled on that account. Very quick way for you to determine which users have MFA and which ones do not. Now, thinking back to CloudTrail, CloudTrail is going to record every action that happens in our environment. So what we're able to do here is use something like CloudTrail in conjunction with users interacting with our AWS account, and we could actually write some filters. We're not going to get into the details of how to do this today, but you could extend out CloudTrail with CloudWatch logs and be able to write filters and generate notifications if somebody logs in without an MFA. So you can do this sort of spot checks through the credential report, and then if you have CloudTrail enabled and integrated with CloudWatch logs, a simple filter would allow you to know or be notified every time somebody logs in without their MFA device. Seems super simple, but is always overlooked. We all have password policies in our corporate environments. We should extend that policy to AWS. In the management console, very simple to set up. Couple clicks or through a command line call, you can create your password policy. Make sure you do this. You want to have things, passwords rotated, controlling the length of password, the reuse, expiry, that kind of thing. So spend a few minutes, find if you have an existing password policy, try to replicate it in AWS as best you can. If you don't have a password policy, now's a great time to come up with one and start with the AWS environment. I mentioned least privilege already. Always practice least privilege. If I have a user in the account that I know just needs to be able to stop and start EC2 instances for whatever their job role is, that's all the access I'm going to give them. This is a very simple sort of look here at an IAM setup. So we've got our production account, and in this account, we've got two groups. We've got a DBA administrative group, and we've got a developers group. And you can see we've got a couple of users associated with those groups. What I would do in this case is understand what both of these groups, what actions they need to perform. Our DBAs are probably going to have to be interacting with the relational database service, maybe DynamoDB. So I'm going to look through those services, and I'm going to define least privilege that allows them to perform their job function and nothing more. The same goes with the developers. They might be working on automated pipelines like code pipeline or code deploy tools. I'm going to give them access to those services, but maybe not going to allow them to interact with the databases from a service level. Okay, so always practice least privilege. Another thing that you need to be very aware of is access keys. So every user that you create, you have the ability to create access keys. Access keys are long-term credentials. There is no automated way in AWS to rotate those credentials. So only assign your access keys when they're actually required. And I can almost guarantee, I've been doing this long enough, that in the majority of cases, people think they need access keys, but they really don't. They're never actually going to use them. Go back to the credential report again is a great way to check this. You're able to see who has access keys and when they were last used. Step one is you don't want to delete them because they might be in scripts and things. We'll talk about that in a minute, but you could disable them and see if somebody complains again. You know, if somebody hasn't used those keys in 6 months, I'm probably pretty sure that they're not going to be used again. So disable and then delete. Only create keys when they're absolutely necessary. Everybody has best intentions, but if you're quickly writing a script and you throw some keys into that script, not a great practice. It gets checked in somewhere and those keys leak out of the environment. So you want to control that. IAM Rules is a great way to avoid having to store credentials in your scripts or on your EC2 instances in particular. So make sure you use them. These are special, it's a special sort of entity that exists in IAM that can use what's called the Security Token Service, STS, to generate random access keys, and those access keys are automatically rotated. So fantastic way, again, to layer security into your account and avoid having to manage access keys that are long-term and they're non-rotating. So make sure you're using roles not only on your EC2 instances, but also if you're running CLI commands, you should be able to set up the CLI service on your workstation in order to assume a role in your account to give you temporary access. So always make sure you do that. So that's sort of a whirlwind tour of setting up security in your account. A lot of things to think about here and some things that can be very quickly overlooked. One of the resources that's a fantastic resource is the CSI AWS Benchmark. I would highly recommend, just Google that, you'll find it. Sorry, I meant to add a link, and as I was getting ready, I forgot to add it. So just Google AWS CIS Benchmark, and you'll find the document. Also, there are a lot of partners out there, including myself, that have audit services built up around that CIS benchmark. So if you need some services, you're concerned about your account, have a look for a partner that you trust. They should be able to help you with auditing your AWS security. So let's talk about billing very briefly here. First and foremost, you want to set up consolidated billing. Consolidated billing is one of the benefits we mentioned with a multi-account strategy. What happens now is you end up with a single bill at the end of the month for all of your AWS accounts, rather than having an individual bill for each account. So everything rolls up into that payer or master account, and you get a bill from that account. It's another nice benefit of multi-account is what you'll find at the beginning, it's quite easy to understand your bill, but as your environment grows, it becomes more difficult. If everything is in one single AWS account, speaking from experience, you're going to end up spending quite a lot of time sitting around discussing who's responsible for what. There are a lot of fantastic tools out there, things like Cloud Health Technologies, that are great ways to help you manage your bill. If that's maybe a little out on the horizon still, a consolidated bill across multiple accounts is a great way to help you allocate costs. So definitely set it up. It's very easy to do. If you're using organizations, you can set it up there very easily. If you have an older account, you can just set it up in the billing platform. So I would highly recommend that you do this. Everything rolls up into a single bill. Don't forget about the importance of budgets. AWS does have budgeting built into the cost console now. So you can go in and you can set budgets on a monthly basis. Once you've got those budgets set up, you can then use CloudWatch, which is the built-in monitoring service that's available free of charge in Amazon, to monitor your budgets and generate notifications if things are going to go past your budget. So if the forecast is above the budget, or if you've actually exceeded the budget, you can generate alerts. So setting up your consolidated billing across multiple accounts and then developing over time your budget, once you understand your actual sort of steady state costs, if you do have them, set up those budgets and then possibly generate alerts to let you know. Again, tools like Cloud Health Technologies would help you with this, but if you're just getting started, it might not make sense right away to leverage a tool like that. So don't forget that some of this functionality is built into the console, and it's very important. Another very important task that gets overlooked, I would say, in almost all of the cases, at least all the cases that I've dealt with, at least at the beginning, is tagging. I think of tagging as a way to add metadata to resources in AWS. So most commonly what you'll find is if you're looking at your AWS bill, the biggest contributors to that bill will be compute, storage, and database. Okay. You may be in a situation where you have a single account, or you've got multiple accounts, but you still have multiple departments running in those accounts. You can use a tagging policy in order to help you understand the resources that are in the accounts that you've created and what they're being used for. So very commonly, you might have a cost center tag, you might have a department tag or a project tag, or maybe an owner tag. The point is, create that tagging policy early on. I would say within the first week of you setting up your AWS account, and then enforce it. Make sure that every resource that is taggable in your AWS environment has those tags. Let's just say you have owner, project, and department. Those are the 3 tags you're going to use. Enforce it. This is where AWS Config comes into play again. You're able to create configuration rules, AWS config rules, to be able to monitor the environment and look at situations where maybe tagging, if you've got a set of tags, resources that don't comply to that tagging policy. As you get more advanced, you can actually do things like, if you don't have these tags, delete the resource. Maybe a little extreme, but sometimes that might be the only way that you can fix the problem that you're having. So develop a tagging policy, tag all resources that are taggable within AWS, and then enforce it with something like config or a third-party tool like Cloud Health again. The other thing that I would mention here is if you're already in an environment that you you've been neglecting the tags, there is the tag editor. So now it is much easier to go back and retrofit or apply tags that you maybe had missed before. If you're just getting started, spend some time now, set up that policy before going forward. Okay. So just to wrap up, we've done a lot of work. We've discussed or decided what our account strategy is, single versus multi-account. I would argue that multi-account is the best way to go. You've made that decision, and now you've created one or more AWS accounts. And you've associated those accounts together. So you have your master or payer account with, like I had in my example, a development or a sandbox account and a production account. So you've got those set up. And then you've secured each of those accounts. You've secured the root credentials, you've secured your IAM users by using least privilege, adding multi-factor authentication, managing through groups, least privilege, all that great stuff. We've done all that. And then we've set up our billing so that we have one bill at the end of the month, detailed billing information about what's happening in the environment, and then we've set up a tagging policy, right? And we know how we're going to enforce that tagging policy. So a couple more slides here. We've done sort of all of what I consider the pre-work, the foundation work that's going to set you up for success later on. So let's talk about, now that you've done that, you're going to deploy your first workloads. What's that look like? First and foremost, I would say use infrastructure as code from day one. I do a lot of training. I do a lot of boot camps, and we talk about infrastructure as code quite often. And I would, anecdotally, I would say the number one question I get is, well, when should I start using, let's say, CloudFormation? I would say yesterday. Okay, it's that powerful. Don't get me wrong, sometimes it's a little difficult. It's got a lot of configuration options. There's lots of things to be aware of, but long term, the benefits outweigh the sort of negative aspects of getting up to speed and managing your templates, okay? So use infrastructure as code from day one. If you want to use a native infrastructure as code solution, have a look at CloudFormation. If you are looking for something that exists outside of AWS, there are lots of tools out there. My favorite is by a company called Fugue. So if you just Google Fugue Computing, you can find that. They make a fantastic, what I would consider to be true infrastructure as code solution, where it controls drift on an ongoing basis in your environment. Regardless of what tool you end up with, make sure you're using infrastructure as code from day one. Virtually everything I've shown up to this slide is actually doable in infrastructure as code. Okay. What's great about infrastructure as code is normally it increases the reliability of your deployments because this is like application code. Once you've debugged it, it's going to work. It also acts as documentation. Okay. And this is one of the biggest benefits I see for the customers and the partners that I work with is documentation is always left to the end. It's rushed. If you have a CloudFormation template or a few composition, then you would be able to use that information to be able to, as documentation, understand what's deployed. So here's a very basic example of a snippet of a CloudFormation template in this case, where I'm creating a virtual private cloud, a VPC. So you can see here, in this case, it's JSON. You can write JSON or YAML, whatever you prefer. I actually do more YAML now than JSON, but it's kind of customer dependent. But I've now defined my VPC. And you can see at the bottom in the tag section, I'm enforcing my tagging policy here. I've got a project code and a department code. All right? We won't get into the details of the different things that are happening in this policy or this template, but use infrastructure as code from day one. Also from day one, use a configuration management tool. Infrastructure as code is going to get you so far. It's going to stand up the services. It's going to create the foundation that your services run on. And yes, you can do configuration management in your CloudFormation templates using something called user data script. I would argue strongly that very much like IAM users and groups, if you're managing your configuration via user data, it's going to get out of hand very, very quickly. As your environment grows, managing user data scripts in your CloudFormation templates can become quite difficult. If you've done any reading in AWS, they talk a lot about decoupling your infrastructure or building loosely coupled applications, microservices, pulling our application apart into its individual components, make it easier to manage, easier to scale. I would argue that pulling your components apart when you think about configuration management and infrastructure as code is also important. Infrastructure stands up the infrastructure. Let's say as an example, it creates my EC2 instance. Configuration management then comes into play once that machine comes to life, that EC2 instance comes to life. I could then execute my recipes if we're using something like Chef. I could execute scripts if I'm running Ansible on those machines to turn them into whatever it is that I would like them to be later on, a web server, an application server, whatever it is. So use configuration management from day one as well. Lots of different things out there, Ansible, Chef, Puppet, SaltStack. Pick which tool, hopefully you already have some expertise in internally or on internally, and leverage that tool into the AWS environment. One last thing here I want to mention is if you're just getting started or if you're in AWS already, I would always recommend that when you're thinking about your deployment strategies, you go serverless first. Okay, and we'll talk about what I think that means in a minute. If you can't do something serverless, then you go to managed services. Things like relational database service is a managed service. I offload a lot of the administration tasks to AWS. I'm more focused on the optimization of the data, the queries that are in the relational database instance. Okay? Then finally, if you have no other option, look at infrastructure as code. So serverless first, followed by managed services, finally followed by infrastructure as code. And let's just talk about serverless very, very briefly here. For me, I define serverless as any time I don't have to think about the specs associated with an operating system or the management of an operating system. So I would consider Simple Storage Service to be a serverless solution. I don't have to worry about the amount of CPU and memory. I don't have to patch an operating system, okay? Lambda is the serverless solution that most people think of. Have a look in AWS, figure out what services, the less operating systems that you have to manage, the better off you'll be, okay? So think about that first. Try serverless first. You're going to need these skills in a very, very short order. So you might as well start working on them now and get that under your belt, or find the resources that can help you with serverless before those resources become, number one, very hard to find, or number two, very, very expensive. Okay. So deployment strategies, I don't want to dive into sort of the services, but infrastructure as code and configuration management from day one, and then think long and hard about how you can deploy serverless solutions before everything else, and then work backwards from there. So that wraps everything up. I missed by about a minute. I wanted to do 45 minutes, so I'm just a little over. So I've left some time for Q&A. We've got a few folks here that if you have any questions, now's the time to ask. You should have a Q&A window that is available for you to ask questions. On top of that, I would also just like to point out, I run a weekly AWS newsletter. It's structured primarily for AWS partners and customers of AWS. If you're interested and would like to subscribe once a week, no spam, you can see here in the bottom, curiousorbit.com/pound newsletter. That'll take you to the homepage location where you can sign up. And that's everything. So thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, so I have one question in the Q&A that just popped up. It's from Steve, and Steve is asking about serverless. And what he's saying here is how would you most commonly get started? So as much as I say there are other services or other serverless services than Lambda, like I said S3 as an example, the API gateway, I would still say Lambda is probably the place that you're going to start. But I would also say, think about step functions. Both Lambda and sorry, hang on one second here. I got something on the window. Both of those services are, whoops. There we go. Both those services are still very early on, both Lambda and step functions, but you can do a lot of very powerful things with it. So you are able to, with Lambda, get rid of, say, scheduled tasks like cron jobs and things like that. We do a lot of managed services for customers, and we used to always stand up an EC2 instance in that customer's account as sort of our management instance, and we would use that to run scripts in the environment. So we've been using Lambda for a while now. When it first came out, we migrated all of those sort of management scripts to Lambda functions and then scheduled them or had them invoked in different ways. Step functions now allows us to build workflow. So we're able to execute Lambda functions in a specific order and then pass output from one function into the other. Because remember, Lambda functions are stateless by design. So with step functions, we're able to perform or pass some state information between functions. So those would be the two that I would start with right away, probably because you have a lot of administrative tasks in your environment that you could offload to Lambda. And Lambda will help you, once you wrap your head around it, it will help you greatly reduce the overall spending in your account because you're able to get rid of operating systems or EC2 instances, right? And those EC2 instances, as I mentioned, are going to be one of the largest contributors to your bill. Lambda, on the other hand, executes the code when you ask it to, either through a schedule or through a call to Lambda, and you pay for that execution, and that's it. No idle operating systems, no patching to be done, right? Lowers the bill. Also, I think increases the overall security of your environment and lowers the administration overhead associated with maintaining that environment. Another question here from Mike. Do you still get free tiers when you do multi-account structure? That's a fantastic question. The short answer is yes. Mike, what I'll do is I'll take it offline for you and I'll get back to you. I'll give you the documentation page. You do get free tier access. You have to be careful though, if you bring in the new accounts after your free tier on your master account has expired, then you're no longer going to get it. So if you set them all up at once, that's fine. If you're in more of a customer environment and you stand up an AWS account for every customer, then you're most likely not going to have the benefit of the free tier. Okay, because it's going to expire on your master account, and my understanding is that flows down. So I'll double check. Any other questions, folks? All right. Well, thank you very much. Again, I appreciate you taking the time out of your day. I know everybody's busy, and if you're in the Toronto area, it is way too nice to be inside today. So I appreciate the time listening to me talk for about an hour. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, get connected there if we're not already connected. Have a look at the website and sign up for the newsletter if you'd like. Next month, we'll be running another webinar. The topic next month will be running your first website in AWS. So look forward to seeing a few of you on that if you're interested. And with that, we'll close it up. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a great day.